Leah?
We are, but I'll let him in when he arrives.
Okay, good. Right, well, welcome everybody to day 4. We have 2 items on the agenda today. Obviously, we've, as previously advertised, we've swapped over the sessions on amendments to IPSASB 5 borrowing costs and accounting and reporting by retirement benefit plans. So because of Dave Warren being on paternity leave this week. We have this morning, therefore, the first session is accounting and reporting by retirement benefit plans. And then we've got the second session on the limited scope update to the conceptual framework. So obviously, we approved the project brief for the new project on accounting and reporting by retirement benefit plans in the March meeting. Since then, there's been a lot of activity, not least the establishment of the task force, which David is chairing. He's on a break from measurement at the moment, so we thought that we didn't want him to get bored, so he's picked up the task force chair on this, along with Mike Mashumi from the South African Treasury, Renee, Kamira, and also Carl Ludwig Sol from the UN system staff pension plan. So a good range of different experiences with using IS 26 at a national level or not. With that, David, perhaps before going to Joe, David, perhaps any opening remarks you'd want to make?
Well, thank you, Ian. Picking up on your comments about the task force, I would like to echo the point about them bringing different experiences and perspectives, which has led to some interesting discussions at the task force meetings that we've had so far. So a big thank you to the various members. I think before I hand over to Joanna, I'd just like to remind the board that this work is not an alignment project. The board agreed that this is an adaptation of the requirements of IS 26. The main reason being that IS 26 is very old. It was published in 1987. And if you look at it from today's perspective, it's written really in a different language. It uses, it doesn't use the terms that we've become used to. It's been written in a slightly different way, which I think probably can lead to confusion in what it is actually trying to get across. And also, it's only what we would now call core text. There's nothing to do with application guidance, there's no implementation guidance, there are no implementation examples, and there are no basis for conclusions, which means that we can't get behind the minds of the people who are writing it. So it is actually quite a challenging project, although it perhaps on the face of it seems to be quite simple. And I think the other key thing is that IS 26 was written for, obviously, the private sector, for pension schemes where there should be assets to fund the future liabilities. We are dealing with the public sector where that is probably not the norm, where actually future pension liabilities are going to be met out of future taxation revenues. And because of that, I think it also suggests that the users and readers of financial information about these particular pension schemes are going to have completely different agendas. They're going to want to know different things, and they're not going to be interested in certain things. So I think I'd urge the board to bear all of that sort of thing in mind as we're going through not just today's discussions, but also when we meet in September, because I think it gives us a little bit more flexibility in determining what it is we want the standard to say, albeit based on certain principles in IS 26. So on that note, if you don't mind, Chair, I'll hand over to Joanna.
Great, thanks, David, and over to you, Jo.
Thanks, Chair and David. I'll just see if I can get this working. Is it all okay? Yep, perfect. So the purpose of today's session is to address 3 out of the 5 issues that were identified in the project brief for retirement benefit plans. And these issues relate to the scope of a potential IPSAS, who the reporting entity is, and the financial statements, which financial statements a retirement benefit plan should prepare. So if we move to agenda item 9.2.1, this paper addresses the question as to whether the scope of an IPSAS adapted from IAS 26 should be expanded beyond what is in IAS 26, which is that a retirement benefit plans are intended to provide an income or a lump sum payment to beneficiaries post-employment, either where the employee retires or they leave that employer. And the issue arose because some retirement benefit plan accounting standards state that the requirements of that standard can be applied to other benefit plans, which have similar characteristics to a retirement benefit plan, but provide other benefits, such as health or dental plans. The task force discussed this issue and determined that there's no public sector reason to expand the scope from what is in IAS 26. But it's been suggested that if an entity does have a benefit plan which has characteristics similar to those of a retirement benefit plan, then they can use an IPSAS adapted from IAS 26 by analogy. And we've developed a basis for conclusion paragraph to indicate this. And this is a similar approach that was taken in IPSAS 32, Service Concession Arrangements Grantor. So my question to the board is, does the IPSASB disagree with this recommendation? So I'll open that up to discussion.
Great, thanks, Jo, for that introduction. Okay, any comments from board members? Yeah, Patricia.
Thank you. I agree with the recommendation about the other kinds of benefits, but my question is in relation to the retirement benefits from non-employees, because the retirement benefits for non-employees are outside of the scope of IPSAS 42, because they do not address the needs of society as a whole, and the inclusion criteria of beneficiaries are not based on social risk. Because this, I think there is a gap in the literature, and the kind of plans are present in some countries, and normally the plan is classified as defined benefits and pay as you go. When a plan is unfunded, payment of retirement benefits may be made from government resources if the rule of the plan is not changed. The government is responsible in the end of the day for the rule change or paying the payment of the benefits. And these plans may have relevant impact on financial condition of government. Here in Brazil, it is a big problem, for example, but I think it's not only in Brazil. Because this, I think the question should be analyzed for the objective to define the scope of the project. Thank you.
So, Patricia, I think we have to be very careful on this one, because certainly I would want to know much more about the scheme that you're describing, but the type of arrangement for non-employees was certainly intended to be covered by the social benefits standard. Now, it may be that there are some problems in interpreting that in the context of the scheme that you're referring to, but I think we have to be very careful that this standard is intended for current and former employees. It's not intended to look at wider benefit plans. And I think given the problems that we had in coming to a standard for social benefits, we cannot go wider than current and former employees with this standard. So I think that's something that perhaps needs to be taken offline for a discussion with staff. But I don't think that we should consider this in terms of an expansion of scope for this project.
Okay, I think there is a gap. I think it's not possible to conclude that IPSAS 32 is applicable. But okay, I take the offline. Thank you.
Thanks, Patricia. Any other comments?
Right, so
Joe?
yep, so it seems like everyone agrees with that recommendation. Thank you very much. So is that the right slide? Hope so. Moving on to agenda item 9.2.
Sorry, did you want to come in before we move on to that next discussion?
Yes, the draft BC paragraph that is at the end, that is in Appendix A. I would suggest we just drop part of the last sentence, where we say that for plans that have characteristics similar to retirement benefit plans, but provide benefits other than an annual income or lump sum payment, I would remove the part of the sentence that starts with but provides benefit other than, because I don't think it's necessarily the case all the time. You can still have different types of benefit plans that do provide annual and lump sum payment post termination service. I would just remove that part of the sentence. Thank you.
Thanks, Renee. I saw a thumbs up from other board members, so I think that seems a reasonable change to make for the reasons that you've outlined. So, Joe, if you can delete that.
Yep, fine.
Thanks. Thanks, Renee. Okay, back to you, Joe.
Okay. So if we move on to agenda item 9.2.2, so this paper addresses who is actually the reporting entity of a retirement benefit plan. And the question was raised as to whether it was actually the plan or the entity administering the plan of the reporting entity. IAS 26 clearly states that that standard regards a retirement benefit plan as a reporting entity. And as the diagram that I've got on this slide illustrates, that you may have an entity that administers several retirement benefit plans. Each of those plans is a separate reporting entity. By restricting the reporting entity to the actual retirement benefit plan, the information provided in the financial statements remains relevant to the users of those financial statements. That is, it's not cluttered by the information that is not relevant. Users are interested in only in the operations of the plan, which may include the assets available to pay benefits, whether contributions have been received, the return on investments, expenses related to investments, whether the plan is in surplus or deficit, and what the actual pension obligation of the plan is that may be funded by the government. The task force agreed that the retirement benefit plan is the reporting entity, and therefore there was no reason to change what is in IAS 26. So does the IPSASB disagree with this recommendation?
Thanks, Joe. So open for comments on that. Not seeing any hands raised at this stage, so I think we agree with that recommendation.
Okay, thank you. So if we move on to the next issue, so this is agenda item 9.2.3. So this is issue 5 in the project brief, and it addresses which financial statements retirement benefit plan should prepare. So we've split this into 2 papers. This paper, we're only concerned now with financial statements excluding the cash flow. We're not talking about cash flow, that's in the next paper. So when you look at IAS 26, it is actually quite difficult to determine which financial statements they do actually require, because they use, as David had mentioned in the introduction, the language they use is quite foreign to what we're used to now. Now we would normally have, you have to produce X, Y, Z. So what we've done is to determine which financial statements an IPSAS adapted from IAS 26 should prepare. We considered the financial statements required by other jurisdictions for their retirement benefit plans, and we also considered the needs of users. So as the agenda paper explains, the retirement benefit plan statements may differ depending on whether the plan is funded or unfunded. Therefore, it's essential that an IPSAS require financial statements that will address all user needs, regardless of whether the plan is funded or unfunded. So the task force decided that any IPSAS adapted from IAS 26 should require a statement of financial position. This is also known as a statement of net assets available for benefits. And this statement should also present the present value of the promised retirement benefits to allow users to determine, firstly, the pension liability, and also where the plan is funded, whether that plan is in surplus or deficit. The task force also agreed that the plan should prepare a statement of changes in net assets available for benefits. And this statement provides information on contributions received, benefits paid, returns on investments, and expenses associated with those investments. Other information the task force agreed should be provided is the changes in pension obligations. So this is a reconciliation from the previous year's pension obligation to the current year's pension obligation. Now, whether this would be in actual financial statement or whether it's a reconciliation in the notes, we had mixed responses from the task force, so we haven't determined in what form that would be, but we do know, I recognise that the information would be needed. And as with all other financial statements, there will be notes to the financial statements. So we've flipped the question to the board about whether, and so the question is, does the IPSASB agree with this recommendation? And I suppose whether there are any other statements they think should be provided.
Thanks, Joe, for that introduction. And yes, in terms of the question, I think we anticipated there might well be quite a lot more discussion on this and differences of views, so hence the more open formulation of the question. Okay, so open up for comments from members on the proposals. Yes, so I've got Lindy and then Mary.
So thank you. I do support the recommendation, and then I guess I thought, let me just share what I was thinking, because I think one of the most important reasons why in my head we were doing this project is because the IPSAS 39 information, which we believe is important to be provided, is not being provided in the public domain, in the public sector. And so I think in considering what information needs to be included by these retirement benefit plans, I think we also mustn't lose sight of the fact that none of the information that we would have wanted or we designed to be reflected through IAS 39 is lost because of an IAS 26 adaptation. So I think we just need to make sure that, you know, we keep that important information. I think then it will then depend on, I guess, what we how we decide to recognize and measure it in here, that might change the location of the information, but I think we still need to bear that in mind, that we want to keep the same level of transparency and accountability as you would get from IAS 39. Thank you. And thanks.
Okay, thanks, Lindy. So I'll go to Mari and then to Mike.
Thank you. I would like to confirm the excluding the cash flow meaning, it means the preparation of the cash flow statement is not mandatorily required. And the main reason why is the cash flow statement is based, the measurement base is based cash base and not the accrual base. Thank you.
Thanks, Mari. So we'll come back on that when we get into the discussion of the cash flow, which is a separate item. I've got Mike and then Nima.
Thanks, Chair. And I did mention to the task force that I would say this tonight. So I support what's being proposed here, but one of the things that worries me is that there's another issue, two other issues we still have to deal with at the task force, one of which is how to treat member contributions or payments to members. Is that an income statement item or is it some other payment? And because that conversation hasn't been held yet, I'm not sure what this statement of changes in net assets will look like, or whether we may need to have reached a conclusion about whether those items are income and expenses before we make a decision tonight. That's my only, I suppose, concern about making a decision tonight.
Thanks, Mike. Joe or David, back on that. I'm not sure that it does actually prevent us taking a decision. I think it's actually the composition of the statement that we're talking about. I don't think this is an issue that should detain us, but I'll go back to Joe or David on that.
Yeah, I'll come back on that. So yes, we understand that we have to, one of the issues we do have to address is whether contributions and benefit payments are revenue or expenses or some other element. I think that in the statement of changes in net assets available for benefits, there is still other information that would be provided in there. So like your return on investments, your expenses related to their investments. So depending on where we land on that contributions and benefits, it may just be whether there is another statement or, you know, the conceptual framework doesn't actually link elements to different statements anyway. So I understand what you're saying, but I think we do still need that statement. And I suppose when we actually get down to look at the detail in what is going to go into each statement, then that will determine whether we do actually require something different like Australia does. They have the, I can't remember the statement they call it, but because Australia doesn't consider contributions and payments as revenue expenses, they consider it to be something else, but that will be addressed in the September meeting. I'm not certain whether, David, whether you want to expand on that.
No, I think that's fine. I think you covered it. Thanks, Joe.
Okay, thanks. So, Mike, you want to come back on that, or are you content with that as the way forward?
Yeah, so look, I'm happy, as I said earlier, we can make, all right, let's make a decision tonight, but I mean, we believe that they're not income and expenses, and therefore they go that they're more in the nature of affecting equity. And I think it's something we just need to, I mean, I don't want to come back to it much later, but if it's not going to be income and expenses, then where do we put it? And if we haven't decided that, then that's something that may change this decision later.
So I think we recognise what you're saying, Mike, but I think also the other thing, when we have that debate, we're going to have to recognise that in many cases, these schemes are not a plan in the private sector sense at all. Basically, they're just, you know, if you like, from a government perspective, you know, something that you have to put money into each year to fund the difference between what's paid in contributions and what has to be paid out in benefits. So I think, you know, some of that's going to come into that discussion, but we recognise the caveat that you've raised at this stage.
Okay.
Okay, so I've got Nima, Todd, then Lucy.
Thank you very much, Ian. I support the recommendation. I was just wondering whether we need to put the statement of budget versus actual as one of the statements there, at least to cover for those plans which are still submitting their budgets to the parliamentary committees and have their financial statements reporting to the parliamentary committees.
Thanks, Nima. Joe or David, do you want to come back on that? I mean, obviously there is, you know, I guess it's a question about the relevance of or the potential use of IPSAS 24 in this case, but has that been considered?
Only partially, I think. I mean, I recognise Nima's point, and certainly from a UK perspective, we would expect it to be there, and I'm sure other jurisdictions where there is an aspect of funding through appropriations through the national budget, it should be there. But I think we can refer to IPSAS 24 for that, because you have options on how you present it. So I think that. Okay.
Well, if you can take that away as an instruction to that we'll need to, you know, address that, you know, in the way we move forward. Okay, that's good. So thanks for that point, Nima. So I go to Todd and then Lucy.
Thanks, Ian. I've probably got a couple of points that I'd like to make, and the first one is probably on the back of what Mike was saying. We're dealing here with a 30-something-year-old standard that we're trying to adapt for our purposes, and I think there is something in what Mike was saying. You know, we've got our conceptual framework to think through when it comes to the statements that we present as well. And as I was working through these papers, when I got to the paragraphs that were talking about the Australian situation, it felt to me like where the Australians had ended up fitted better conceptually. So I think there is something that we're going to have to work through when we actually consider member contributions, etc., and that side of it. So that could change things a little in my mind, at least at this point. The other point that I just wanted to raise here was, if we are going to come up with some statements that are required for retirement benefit plans that are different to IPSAS 1, is the standard that we are trying to come up with here going to essentially say you don't apply IPSAS 1 if you're a retirement benefit plan, and you will apply what the standard that we're coming up with says, and then maybe other IPSASs will be applicable, but are we going to quite specifically exclude IPSAS 1 in terms of this paper from that consideration? So it was just that question that I had in my mind as I was reading through this paper as well.
Thanks, Todd. So we note your first point, as with Mike's previous comments. I don't know, back to you, Joe or David. Is that something that's been considered yet, or is that due for consideration?
We haven't actually considered it yet, but IS 26 does state that that standard overrides other standards. So I would expect that because I would expect that it would override IPSAS 1, because the information that we're actually asking is completely different to what you would expect from other reporting entities. It is quite specialised, but as I said, we haven't actually discussed that yet, but there is that override part in IS 26. Okay, so that's an instruction that you know, we need to specifically address for September, please. Okay, so Lucy and then Mark.
Thanks, Chair. Actually, my comment is the same as Nima's, and Mike's first is on Nima's comment about statement of budget, comparison of budget and actual amounts. I think this is very applicable, especially for the unfunded plans, where the payment of pension benefits will be made from government resources. So the parliamentarians would really be very, it will be a very useful tool for them, and especially that if they want to see the impact of the government pensions on their future government resources. And then on the possible inclusion of a statement of financial performance, because there can be differing treatment, accounting treatment on the contributions, employers and employees' contributions, just like what I shared last time, that there are differing accounting treatments. Some would one entity administering the funds treats this as income, and then the others would treat them as equity. So and even in the IAS 26, there are administrative expenses, for instance, or other expenses that may be that may be charged to the plan, and of course these are stated in this statement of changes in net assets available for benefits, but maybe they can be relocated in a statement of financial performance, and the result of that would then be forwarded to the statement of changes in net assets or bar equity. So, but of course we can take a look at this in our September meeting. But maybe these are thoughts that we may consider with regard to our future discussions. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. So Mark and then Mike, you want to come back in, and then I'm going back to staff at that stage.
The first part of my comment was actually a similar one Todd has raised, the linkage to IPSAS 1. I would have originally favored an IPSAS 1 approach, saying all statements are applicable, but there can be, if some statements are not material or not used, then can be left off. But nevertheless, I think it's good that we look at if the board has favors another approach, it's fine. But then I think it's important to look at it, the link to IPSAS 1 definitely for the next September meeting. And what I think is also very important, I think, is that whether some are shown in the net asset or in the income statement for contribution, I think it will be important to see what is the nature of the contributions? Are they ordinary contributions, or are they coming from restructuring contributions, or also contributions paid by third parties? And I think this information is maybe more important than the question in which statements they are. So I think just to raise this additional point.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I'm just trying to, as a member of the task force, understand what I've got to do, what we've got to do as in relation to Lucy's and Nima's questions about use of budget information. If I've got the question wrong, or maybe I've misunderstood what they've said, but that's why I want to clarify. I mean, in my experience is that these sort of plans are not consolidated to whole of government accounts, because the money belongs to the members and therefore they're outside of the government. So if you're going to ask for budget information to go in, I'm not sure what that's going to look like, because there's no budget other than the government may have estimated to put some money into the fund, and that could be dealt with in another financial statement altogether. So I just want to clarify, have I heard this right?
Well, you see, Mike, I think that's where the type of fund that you're looking at is very different to the type of fund that you have in other jurisdictions, because certainly if I just articulate what happens in the UK, basically we have the major central government schemes are all unfunded. They're all pay as you go. And so basically the government each year has to make good the difference between the contributions received and the payments out. So there is no fund. So, you know, that's where basically money comes in from people who are contributing to the scheme, and the difference between what gets paid out in benefits is basically a call on the consolidated fund, and that is appropriated each year. So therefore, in that context, budget information is actually very relevant, and you quite often get differences in discount rates, and the liability information is really the key, and the liability is what gets put in the whole of government accounts balance sheet.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's actually a very different situation, and it may be that actually what we need to do is actually even consider whether we have alternatives in this situation, depending on the nature of the scheme. So I think that's what's going to need to be considered. From a whole of government point of view, it's the extent of the liability that's the really important information, and that's what's missing at the moment from a PFM perspective.
Okay, so I agree with that, and our schemes are the same. We're also unfunded, so we also, but the budget information that you're referring to appears in the accounts of the Treasury in our case, rather than in the accounts of the fund. But I hear what you say. We'll take it on board. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So I've got. Sorry, Ross. Did you want to come in on that before I go to Lindy and Renee?
Just a quick point. I think the question the task force probably needs to look at is whether it needs to make IPSAS 24 a required standard to apply or not. Because once you're in IPSAS 24, it tells you when you have to provide budget information and when you don't. And it's quite clear on that, because it's not in all cases. So you have to have an approved budget, and it has to be publicly available. So if you're in the condition when you don't have those things, it doesn't apply. So I wouldn't have the task force redeliberating that aspect. It's whether or not we should be referring to 24 or not in this guidance. So I think it's a rather more simple question.
Thanks, Ross. I think that's helpful. But the discussion that Mike and I have had is also going to be relevant in terms of whether, in terms of the debate on income versus, member contributions, because it's very different in a situation where there is no fund and you just have a right to receive benefits from a scheme. Lindy and then Renee.
Yeah, thanks. And perhaps I'm just saying what Ross said, because I think IPSAS 24 only applies if your budget is publicly available and you held accountable to the extent of what is made available in the public domain. So I don't think it matters if you've funded by government or not. It's whether or not you make that instrument publicly available and how you are held accountable to it. So I'm not too sure if, as a reporting entity, a fund would budget for at that level of detail that would be useful. But I guess maybe the task force can look at that. But it's not dependent on whether you receive money. It's how you make that information available. Thanks.
Thanks, Lindy. Renee.
That's okay. I think my point has been made. Thank you.
Great. Adrian.
Thank you, Ian. I have a question that relates to the position of the funding entity. When we talk about governments coming to cover the unfunded plans at some point in time, I see that there is a substantial difference if the government is only doing that as the employer, so one of the parties that have interest in the operations of the plan, or if the government is just, acting in the public interest, in the general public interest, to have the plans, rightly balanced. And then, even if the plan is unfunded, but when the government acts as the employer and only as the employer, I wonder if the financial statements that are prepared for the sole information of users, beneficiaries, and the employer are not special purpose financial statements, because they're not for the general public. When they are unfunded and the government is not the only employer, I would say, then they are, for the information of the general public. So I was wondering if we should not, introduce a difference in the presentation of what are the purpose of the financial statements in those two cases?
Thanks, Veritrin. I mean, I think that's, that what this is leading to is actually there may need to be alternatives here depending on the purpose of the scheme and the way in which the scheme is set up. And I think probably we need to pass that one back to the task force and staff to consider for next time. Probably from a PFM point of view, the key thing is that liability and the responsibility for that liability. But I think we probably need to pass that one back to the task force. And I think actually the comments that members have made have actually, started to reveal that diversity of types of arrangements. I don't know if Joe or David, you want to comment on?
Well, I think, members are right in as much as, depending on the nature of the scheme, the information that will be presented in the financial statements may differ. But I don't think that gets away from the fact that whatever the nature of the scheme, you need a statement of financial position. Whatever you might call it, you need a balance sheet. However you determine what to call contributions received. Are they equity contributions or are they revenue? You still need a statement that shows them. So I don't think that anything that anybody has said so far detracts from the recommendation of staff of the task force. What it does mean is that we're going to need to be very careful when we write the standard to make sure that we give sufficient clarity in the standard to address the different circumstances that may pertain. Because even in the UK, we know we've got some funded schemes, some partially funded schemes, mostly unfunded. So if you've got those three situations in one jurisdiction, just think what the rest of the jurisdictions are going to have between them. So we do need to be careful. I think picking up on the point about IPSAS 24, my view would be much as Ross has expressed. We would require IPSAS 24 to be applied when it is applicable. You don't need to say anything more than that. And that would then apply to the schemes in the UK. So you would get the information that you needed. And if, as Lindy says, a retirement benefit plan doesn't prepare that and isn't required to prepare that, then IPSAS 24 doesn't apply. So, I think it should be fairly straightforward to deal with. It's going to take some clarity in the way we write it.
Thanks, David. Any further comments? So I think coming out of that discussion, we agree with the overall recommendation in terms of presentation of the statements recommended by the task force, with the obvious caveat about the way in which the payments, if I can just call them payments into the scheme, are recorded within the financial statements. The point came up in terms of IPSAS 24, and we need to make it clear that that would be applicable, or that would need to be applied where it is applicable within the guidance. And then we're going to need to have this look at what are the implications depending on the nature of the scheme and whether it's fully, partially or not funded, and how that impacts. And I think that we're going to have to look at that obviously in September. Okay. Good. Okay, so thanks for that. I think that was a very helpful discussion in getting us into the issues and how we're going to have to deal with the differences between different jurisdictions. So take us on to the final topic for today, Joe.
Sure. So we're going to the final agenda paper, which is 9.2.4. And so we're only focusing on whether an IPSAS adapted from IAS 26 should require a cash flow statement. There were mixed interpretations from the task force about whether IAS 26 actually requires a cash flow statement. And I think that's because of that override sentence that is in IAS 26. The New Zealand board concluded that it does require a cash flow statement, and so therefore to make sure that there was no uncertainty, they've actually included a specific paragraph stating as such. We've reviewed the approaches of other standard setters, and there were mixed approaches. Some required a cash flow statement, others didn't. And there were also mixed views from the task force about whether we should actually mandate a cash flow statement. But after the last task force meeting, David and I had a discussion and concluded that particularly for unfunded plans, the information provided in a cash flow statement is useful to users as it actually shows the amount of funding that will come from the government. This is the only statement where it will actually show this funding, because it's not a contribution, but the government will make a payment to the retirement benefit plans to make the beneficiary payments. But because of we didn't come to a conclusion in the task force, we made the recommendation in this paper that an IPSAS adapter from IAS 26 should strongly encourage, but not mandate, a requirement for a cash flow statement. I know we've had some feedback from board members that they say that, yes, we should mandate a cash flow statement. I'd like to land one way or the other. I don't like this just strongly encourage. I'd like to say yes or no. So I'm going to open that up to the board for discussion about well, I actually put, do you agree with the recommendation, but I'd actually rather a yes or no. We provide a cash flow statement.
Okay, thanks, Chair. I think we know where you stand, so I'll open it for discussion and see where we get to. Okay, anybody want to kick us off? Yes, Sajith.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. I just want to first ask a question from Joanne, whether now in relation to the cash flow statement, one of the benefits that was mentioned was the contribution from the government can be shown in an unfunded plan, and I want to know whether that portion cannot be shown in the form of a note, or as a breakup of the contributions that are received, contribution received from the participants, or contribution received from the beneficiaries, and the contribution received from the government, whether that can be shown in the breakup in the notes in relation to the statement of changes in net assets available for beneficiaries. Can I ask a question from her, so you could, and I could respond after that? Thank you.
So, Joe, do you want to just get on that?
I could come back on that one, Chair. I was quite interested in the contributions of the birds singing in Ajith's background. I thought it made quite a lot of sense. I think the question of the classification of items within the cash flow statement, either are they investing activities, operating activities, or whatever else, that the task force acknowledges that if we had a cash flow statement, we would need to look at that, because that is what is causing or has caused some confusion, particularly when Carl Ludwig was talking about that at a task force meeting. So we do take that point. I think the question that I'd like to go back to Ajith and say, do you believe, Ajith, that we should have a cash flow statement as long as we can work out where the various categories of cash flows sit?
Yeah, I think my view is that because we're having a statement of changes in assets and we're having a statement of financial performance, there is no need, I feel, to have a cash flow statement. And if there is no need to have a cash flow statement, and I think we should not encourage having a cash flow statement, because we have too much information, then it could have a negative effect of having having too much information. So it might draw less attention to the other statements, and therefore it may be appropriate to not to encourage if you consider that cash flow statement is not required. So I feel that if there is a problem in relation to the contribution from government not sufficiently shown, we could require that to be shown in the form of a note in the statement of changes in relation to the statement of changes in assets available for benefits. That was my view. Thank you.
Thanks, Sajith. Lynn.
So I'm of the view that why wouldn't we require a cash flow statement? I think we should require a cash flow statement. Financial statements are always criticised for not being understandable, but the one statement that the layperson can understand is a cash flow statement. So my view is, on balance, we should include it. I think we should potentially revisit when we land on things like how members' contributions are going to be treated and the like, but in principle, I support the requirement to include a cash flow statement.
Thanks, Lynn. So I'll go to Todd, then Camira.
Thank you, Ian. In the many years that I've been involved in standard setting, I've been quite a proponent of the cash flow statement. And I recollect a time in New Zealand that we had a differential reporting regime that didn't require a cash flow statement for some of our smaller entities. And I really struggled with that because, as Lynn has pointed out, I think most people can get their head around a cash flow statement. And I think there's quite good information value in a cash flow statement. And so I would be very supportive of requiring a cash flow statement. I think for me to agree not to have a cash flow statement, I need some really good, strong arguments against it. And as I say, in my many years of standard setting, I have yet to have been convinced.
Okay. Thanks, Todd. So what I'll do is I'll take the round of comments from members, and then I think we might just do a straw poll on where members actually are. So just to flag that we will be doing that. I think that'll be helpful to see the sense of those that are in favour of requiring a cash flow statement versus those that are in accordance with the task force recommendations to encourage but not require. Okay, so I've got Camira next, then Lindy, then Bernard, and then Adrian.
Thanks, Chair. As I mentioned during the task force discussions, and also in line to what the comment of Mari early on, I think if we as a board, we decide to exclude or not require the cash flow statement, we can be signaling that this new standard is cash-based and not accrual, because that would mean also during the discussion, one of the reasons for not including the cash flow is that, well, it's a lot of workload to do it, and it's very similar to the statement of financial performance or the other name that we would like to give it to it. So it will mean that we are not, so the standard is cash-based and not accrual. So we should be careful on that. So I will support the requirement of the cash flow statement. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Camira. So I've got Lindy next, and then Bernard.
Thank you. And I also support the inclusion of a cash flow statement for the reasons raised. And also, I mean, we need to think about where we would land with the contributions and funding from government. I guess the other perspective is that certainly in my own experience with our pension fund, we have recorded a lot of or significant amount of impairments on investments in the past few years. And I think without a cash flow statement, you kind of don't get to see the different lens that you should because of these actuarial gains and losses that are reflected in the impairments. And often you don't get to see the actual cash position because of that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Lindy, so go to Bernard next, and then Adrian afterwards.
Yeah, thanks. I also support the inclusion of a cash flow statement, and I think we previously said it's a reporting entity, and we had a bit of a debate on whether it's a general purpose financial statement. So if it is, like Todd said, and Lindy said, and all the others said, I think we have to have a strong reason for not having a cash flow statement. But also acknowledging the points, David, you made that there might be issues with presentation and how to classify.
Good, thanks, Bernard. Adrian, and then Leslie.
Thank you, Ian. Well, I personally would not support the inclusion of cash flow statement. And first of all, when reading paragraph 6 of the agenda item, I see the argument for requiring cash flow statements because IAS 26 paragraph 2 states that all those standards apply. Well, this is not, for me, this is not a good argument, good reason. We preliminary said that is not an alignment, but an adaptation. And what I understand from my experience is that the most important information for users is the coverage of the plan and the efficiency of the investment policies, okay, to support this coverage. So, of course, the cash flow statement is not irrelevant. It has some relevance, but I believe that it has a reduced, not even, well, possibly sometimes very, very poor relevance to the information of the user. So I'm very, focused on relevance of the information that is provided in financial statements. So if it's poorly relevant, I would believe that its usefulness is also reduced. Therefore, if we want to go for cost efficiency, I would not support the issuance of a cash flow statement as mandatory, but as a possibility that is not, excluded by the standards in the standard in the end. So, well, this would be my position on that.
Okay, thank you. So, Leslie, to you, and then I think I will go for a show of hands at that stage and see where we are amongst members.
Thanks, Chair. I support the inclusion of cash flow statement as one of the statements for this retirement benefit plans because, as mentioned in IAS 26, in the contributions should be invested actually. And we are accounting for the investment income. And so we would like, if the user should also know, should be provided with information how on the movement of the money that comes in and out of the retirement plan. So, and how much, for instance, had been generated from investment activities, or how much has been spent on operating activities. So I think it is a vital financial statement that should be included. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Renee, you want to come in, and then we'll do a show of hands.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a bit of additional insights from experience. So in Canada, there is no requirement for a cash flow statement. And one of the main reasons which was discussed during the task force deliberations is the fact that the statement of change in net assets will show, I say will because we haven't decided this as a board, but currently in IAS 26 and in which is similar to our Canadian standards, that statement of change show all of the key elements, all of the ins and outs impacting the net assets. So contributions from employer, contribution from employees, payment of benefits, and so on and so forth, revenues from investment income. So when you look at a statement of change in net assets, it resembles a lot a cash flow statement. And that's one of the points also that Carl made in his own experience as a preparer of the UN pension plan scheme. He felt that he would have been duplicating Also, the difference between accrual basis versus cash basis. In the case of contributions, usually in the scheme, your employer and employee contributions are made regularly, and there's usually a small timing difference, of contributions maybe accrued and payable at the end of a fiscal period. So that little timing difference is maybe what would show as a difference between what you show as a contribution from employer in your change in net asset versus in a cash flow. And it would be very small and maybe not very relevant or very useful. So to Adrian's point. So also I think that, so the two statements could look very similar. And one of Carl's point was that when he used to present it, because I think at some point in his past, he used to present it, he was always challenged by users trying to understand, well, why are they different? Why are they different? And then he would get bogged down and go down in a rabbit hole trying to explain the dynamic of accrual accounting, because that's really one of the big difference. I do take Lindy's point, though, that if there is a significant impairment on asset, that's not cash. But again, your statement of change in net asset will itemize, or we could decide as a board that these items are clearly indicated, and based on their nature, it's pretty obvious whether they're cash or not. So I just wanted to offer that. Personally, my reflection is maybe we should wait to see what a cash flow statement would look like and the statement of net change would look like. And if we feel that they would obscure the financial statements overall, because they would be two versions of similar transactions, maybe that's a case for considering not making it mandatory. Thank you.
Thanks, Renee. Very helpful to have that input in terms of the Carl Ludwig Sol's experience. So I think at this stage, we've had views expressed both in favour of mandatory inclusion of a cash flow statement, views in favour of the task force position in terms of, however it's couched, but encouraged, but not required. So I think literally I just want to get a sense of where the board is on those two positions at this stage. So if I can just have a show of hands from board members in terms of those who would be in favour of making a cash flow statement mandatory. So if you can just hold those hands up for the time being.
I think I counted 12.
And that was including Scott and Adrian?
Yes.
Okay. And so if I can have a show of hands in favour of the strongly encourage.
I'm counting 3.
Oh, I thought I saw 4 actually. Adrian, I think you were in favour, weren't you, on that? Is that right?
I'm not in favour, but if the alternative is recommend but not mandatory, I have to vote for that one, or otherwise I would abstain.
Okay, so I mean, I think, on a strict reading of, in terms of passing the exposure draft, we would need 2/3 of the members. Ross, do you want to just come in at this stage?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that clearly we've got a majority for proposing that we make it mandatory. And I just want to highlight that this could be a place to ask a question to get feedback. It is an exposure draft. So if the board isn't quite convinced, it's always a good opportunity to ask constituents the reasons for or against it and get that feedback explicitly. So it's good that we've got a decision. I would just flag that's a good place for the task force to develop an SMC.
Okay, so board members happy with that as the way forward. I mean, I think as Renee said in her summary, you know, we've already agreed that we're going to have the statements of changes in net assets. You know, as a required statement, we will need to do the work on the cash flow statement anyway. So I think that would support that approach. Okay, good. So thanks for that. I think that was a good discussion. Actually, useful to hear those points put forward, and I think we should make sure that those points actually are spelt out in DCs as well. You know, because I think that's been a good, rich discussion that our stakeholders should be aware of, and those using standards eventually, the standard eventually. Great. Okay. So back then to Joe and David. Anything else you need from the board today?
No, I think I'm fine. I think we've got enough to go on with, and we'll bring the other issues back in September. And a draft ED, the first look at the draft ED. Great. Okay. We'll look forward to that. So thanks to both of you. Thanks again to the task force for the work that's been put in. I think that enabled us to have a very good discussion today. So you know, thanks everyone. I think that was that worked out well. Okay, so with that, we draw to a close on that item. We will move on then to the first part of the discussion on the next stage of the conceptual framework update. So, John, that's over to you to introduce the item.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. And Joe's kindly agreed that Joe's going to share the screen and move on my slides. So thanks a lot to Joe for her help on that, because you all remember the pickle I got into in March. Okay, there are 3 papers on the Conceptual Framework Limited Scope Update: Service Potential, Prudence, and Materiality. And the idea is to try and get agreement in all these areas so that the results of that agreement can be incorporated in the ED of chapters 3 and 5 of the framework, which will be brought to the board in September. That is the revised chapters on qualitative characteristics and constraints, chapter 3, and chapter 5 on elements. Okay, could we move on then, Joe, please? Okay, the first issue is service potential. Now, service potential, and this is agenda item 8.2.1, service potential was not in the project brief, which was approved in March 2020, but because of the standards level issues, particularly in the development of the measurement ED 76, that arose with the definition of service potential, we are proposing that we make a small change to the way in which service potential is described in the framework. And that is quite simply to remove the reference to capacity and to replace that with a reference to ability to provide services. And we feel that by simply making that small tweak, we will avoid any conflict with descriptions and use of service capacity in the core text and application guidance of ED 76. So if we could move, and that's what that paragraph will look like up on the screen. So if we could move on, the board sponsor, that's Ian as chair, and my recommendation is firstly that in light of its prevalence in our literature and its importance as a public sector characteristic, that many, if not most, assets held by public sector entities for which the IPSASB is developing standards are used for the purposes of delivering services rather than primarily for cash generation, that we need to retain the concept of service potential. And further to that, that the description of service potential in the framework should be amended in the way I've just described. And through the chair, if I could ask whether the board disagrees with these recommendations, which we think are important but fairly small scale. Okay, thank you at that point.
Thank you for the introduction there, John. So if I can open that up for anybody who disagrees with that recommendation. Yeah, Trisha.
Thank you. Maybe it's a problem with the use of language, but for me, capacity and ability, it's not so different. Because capacity can be understood with the ability to do something. And during the discussion about the measuring basis, the term service capacity has the problem with the potential service. And in my view, the question here is the service is the attribute of the asset and not the product of the asset. Consequently, I think the problem is not with the term of capacity, but the term of the service. Because this, my suggestion is change or to think about the use of the term service and relate to the concept of assets. I don't know what the discussion about the changing the definition of assets, but when I think the service of the assets can generate economic benefits or contribute to activity entity's objective. Yes, because this I disagree with the modification, the proposal.
Okay, thanks, Patricia. So I'm going to take comments from others. So go to Linda and then Adrian.
Thank you. I guess for reasons I can't fully recall, but I do think the wording was quite specifically included in that way in the drafting of the conceptual framework originally. And I think it was probably more to make it quite neutral and not make it entity specific, because the entity specific consideration comes in when you determine whether or not this is a resource that you're going to account for. And I'm just worried that by changing it, we kind of lose that original intention but I didn't have opportunity to go back to all the exposure drafts and the documents on the conceptual framework, but I do remember that there was quite a big debate around specifically the wording and including capacity in the final wording and in the deliberations. Thanks.
Thanks, Cindy. I mean, I don't think we should be prisoners of the original debate on this, because I think what we're finding is that there are unforeseen consequences in terms of the way that wording has been applied. And I think outflow of resources was a classic example of that. So I think, I mean, the proposal was purely to try and avoid some difficulty that's emerged when we've used the framework in practice. I think we need to understand whether there would be an objection to the change, not, the nature of the debate necessarily, unless that does illuminate, the discussions back in 2011, 2012, 2013 illuminate that. Adrian.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I feel confused as a French speaker to get in a terminological conversation about capacity or ability. But my feeling is that it doesn't add anything to capacity by moving to ability even more. It reduces the understandability of the definition. I would say that capacity is an inherent characteristic. Capacity is substantially attached to the set. Ability is more operational. It's about the essence of the asset when you say capacity, as I understand it. But okay, I think it's Patricia. Patricia, you said that there was not much of a difference between capacity and ability, and I would agree to that. I don't know if the readers will be aware of the distinction between capacity and ability, and the one that I'm just making. But I think there is, but I don't know if they will be aware of that, and that I don't see a real need for change now that we have used in this definition. Of course, capacity is used in other meanings elsewhere, but in this definition, I would support not changing the definition in using ability.
Okay, thanks, Adrian. Go to Scott and then back to you, John.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Sorry about my voice. But anyway, I looked them up in the dictionary. So if this helps anywhere, they're synonyms, folks. So they're actually synonyms to each other. So I think they're interchangeable. There's another word, capability. And so at the end of the day, I felt like they were a pretty switch. And if it helps with communication, I'm fine with the change. But they are synonyms, if you're wondering about it. So.
Thanks, Scott. So I go back to John, and then I'll take, because I've got more hands going up at the moment. So John.
Yeah, certainly I agree very much with what Scott says, that they are synonyms. The reason for the change is really a clarification rather than any change of substance. It's simply that in the context of both the leases project and the measurement project, some confusion has arisen with the use of the word capacity. So, for example, in the discussions on measurement, we use the word capacity in the context of surplus capacity and how that influences measurement decisions. We've used the term operational capacity in the context of the proposed measurement basis current operational value. So all this is trying to do is to just use probably a more straightforward term, that if you've got an asset that you use for service, primarily for service delivery, then that actually meets the definition of a resource. That's a resource, and therefore meets the definition of an asset. So it's no more ambitious or complex than that.
Okay, thanks, John. So I've got David, Mike, and then Adrian, you want to come back in? So,
Thank you, Ian. As you know, sort of speaking as the task force chair of measurement, yes, the use of the word capacity did cause problems, because you can think of as capacity as volume, and so if you're looking at spare capacity, you're talking about volume, whereas the use of the word capacity here, as I would agree, is much more the ability. But if that is going to cause problems in translation, then maybe we should actually ask staff to see if there's another word that could be used to get rid of the ambiguity. And it might mean that John would need to work with Patricia or something just to find a word that doesn't translate as the same thing.
Thanks, David. Mike, and then Adrian.
Thanks, Ian, and I suppose I support Scott's comments and what David's just said. And I would also observe that the word service capacity is used in IFRS 13 in the context of applying the cost approach to measuring an asset's fair value. So it really is worth staff, I think, look at all these uses of this term to make sure we've come up with the right one. So I mean, overall, I support ability, but I'm a bit like David. I don't want to create confusion with other languages.
Okay, so Adrienne and then Patricia.
Yeah, just to say that in the military business, they use the word capability to express the aptitude to deliver an operational service, I would say. So I would very happily support capability. That could merge the two words, capability as proposed by Scott, because this would really make sense and would avoid confusions with the other uses of capacity elsewhere or whatever ability if it's used anywhere else in IPSAS.
Thanks. I'm always in awe of those who can comment on these things in a second language, which shows my inability in other languages. So thank you very much for that helpful intervention there. So Patricia, back to you.
Thank you. We have similar words in Portuguese too. My question here is capacity and ability has the similar may have the similar means. It's not. I think it's not a problem with the translation, not for Portuguese. But maybe I'm not clear about my question here. My question is: we discussed the definition of assets, and during the discussion about the definition of assets, IPSASB definition of assets, the question about the kinds of benefits that assets may generate, the benefits can be economic or other kinds of benefits. And the first question is, I think the discussion about the potential service have to be connected with the discussion about the definition of assets. And my point here is specifically about the potential service is the attribute of the assets, and the entity can use the assets and consequently the attribute of the assets to produce economic benefits or to contribute to achieve its objectives. It's not only the change the words, but the change the understanding of what is service in relation to what is the service of the assets. It's my point. My suggestion is discuss the potential service in connection with the discussion of definition of assets. Thank you.
Okay, so I think in terms of the way to take this forward, I think, one of the things we have to think about very carefully is it's not just assets that contribute to providing services. It can be the use of staff, volunteers, and so on. So I think we have to think very carefully that there is not a direct linkage. Assets can contribute to service provision, but they're not the only input to that. So I think we need to be aware of that in thinking through what you've proposed, Patricia, which is that we should have a look at any potential changes to our definition of asset arising from the debate that ISB had. So I think in the debate that we've had, certainly I've heard that just the substitution of the word ability, people are not, don't really sort of see the need, that doesn't really make a difference. The term capability has certainly been, proposed in order to address the problem that we do have because of the term capacity elsewhere in our our literature. So I think in terms of the way forward, I think quite reasonably you said, Patricia, that this should be seen in the context of the discussion that we will have in September on whether we change our definition of assets or not. So I think, John, in terms of taking that forward, if you can take forward the proposal that, you know, basically, I think there are two options here. Either we substitute the term capability in the term service potential, or we leave it as is, and we deal with the consequences elsewhere at standards level. But we will take that decision in the context of any proposed changes in the definition of assets in the conceptual framework when that comes back in September. Members happy with that as proposed way forward? John, does that make sense from the staff perspective?
Yes, that's fine. That's fine.
Okay, good. So I think at that point in time, we will break. So we will break until 22, and then we will come back and then we'll have a look at Prudence and the conceptual framework. Okay, thanks everyone. See you at that stage.
1 minute.
Good. Okay. Well, thanks everyone for coming back promptly. So, John, lead us into the item on prudence.
Okay, thank you. This is agenda paper 8.2.2. And if we could move on. In pages 4 to 5 of the paper, we bring forward 3 options for dealing with prudence. To firstly note that currently prudence is not included in the core text of our framework, either as a qualitative characteristic in its own right or as an explanatory factor in faithful representation. So the 3 options we've identified are to retain the current position in our framework. In other words, to say nothing in the core text, as is the case, retain the status quo, to adopt an approach where we clarify prudence along the lines of what the IASB did in its 2018 framework. And that was quite a significant change in the IASB's framework between the 2010 framework and the 2018 framework. So that would not involve including prudence as a QC, but it would involve a discussion in the core text as a reinforcement of neutrality in the context of faithful representation. The third option is to go down the route of specifically adopting prudence as a qualitative characteristic in its own right. Now, the board sponsor and staff don't see any reason to adopt prudence as a QC in its own right. And we haven't identified any public sector reason that has emerged in applying the framework to adopt it as a QC. We think that there is a case for simply doing nothing and retaining what is currently in the framework for the reasons I've given and the reasons which are stated in paragraph 14 of the paper. So that would suggest that the existing explanation in the basis of conclusions is appropriate. We complement that possibly with a further statement to having considered the issue again in the limited scope update project, but no change having ensued. And the reason is further that we think there's an adequate discussion in the chapter of the framework dealing with recognition, which considers measurement uncertainty. So the view would be that saying anything else simply is superfluous, as stated in paragraph 14. We think that there is, however, a case from a point of view of clarifying prudence to adopt the approach that the ISB made in its 2018 framework. And we think that this would firstly respond to the view that we've insufficiently considered prudence. And we also think that it might, as the ISB have indicated, provide some clarification of prudence so that there aren't differing interpretations. So overall, staff and the board sponsor suggest that we go down the route of option B. That is to say, amending the framework's chapter 3 to include a reference to prudence as a reinforcement of neutrality in the context of faithful representation. And the preliminary drafting, if we go down this route, is proposed in paragraph 19. And that would involve the insertion of 2 paragraphs after existing paragraph 3.14 in the framework. And at that point, I'll go back to the chair.
Thanks, John, for the introduction. Okay, so open up for comments from members. Lucy and then Camira.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I actually agree with the board sponsor and staff recommendation. Okay, but I do not agree with the paragraph 3.14a as it is now stated. I suggest that we remove the last sentence of the proposed 3.14a because it may cause confusion to stakeholders since it appears to be contradictory to the position that the exercise of prudence does not lead to business statements, or because it says in the third sentence that equally the exercise of prudence does not allow for the understatement of assets or revenue or the overstatement of liabilities or expense. So I think we have to stop there because such misstatements can lead. The last sentence is not really I think it is contradictory to the preceding sentences. Thank you.
Right. Thanks, Lucy. What I do want to do is, if the board supports the proposed way forward, then we'll come back and pick up the sort of specific comments on the proposed drafting there. But we've noted your comment on that now. So I've got Camira, then Mark, then the Adrienne, then Bernard.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, John, for the presentation. I disagree with the staff recommendation on basically what I will propose that we include prudence as a qualitative characteristics. Why? First, from my experience, I know that in the European context, or in EPSAS, at least in the draft EPSAS conceptual framework, the prudence has been included, and there are several countries that are really supporting the inclusion of the prudence qualitative characteristics. In Latin America, I have taken a look in internet and what several countries they have, and they recognize it as it's called principio contable or accounting principle, but prudence is in there. And some of those countries are Costa Rica, Peru, Colombia, Chile, Bolivia, Mexico. So which means that the concept of prudence is really relevant. What I have identified that there are differences in the definitions, totally different. So in this context, I identify a need to have at least include prudence as a qualitative characteristic, so that all those countries that are considering prudence so important, so that they can harmonize their definitions or their interpretations of it. So that's why I disagree with the staff recommendation on that. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Camilla. But just to push back on that, by including it by the staff recommendation, you would still get a clearer discussion of what prudence actually is, which countries could align around. So I think, you know, we don't have to align with what countries are doing. It's because this is an international framework. So I think, you know, what we're trying to do is get clarity here. That doesn't necessarily argue for having it as a separate QC. Can I go to Mark and then Adrienne and then Bernard?
I think what you've just said, Chair, I think it's important to say what do we want to achieve actually. And I think the staff recommendation or the intention that this provided is to, if I read it right, is to reinforce neutrality in the context of faithful representation. And if this is the goal, I'm in full support. Now the question is prudence the right word for that? I have some doubts, or the question is, I also see the rationale, also the ISP, when say that in conditions of uncertainty and when making judgment, you have to exercise caution. But then again, the word caution, I ask myself, isn't it rather diligence or being careful what we're looking for? Because if we use the words like caution and prudence, at least in my jurisdiction, if you translate the word prudence, it will be understood really as rather, definitely will be more going to the direction to say that an understatement of asset is better than an overstatement. And I don't think if this is the conclusion, then I think that the neutrality principle is actually not reinforced but weakened. So I definitely think we should stick to this neutrality. And so I'm also rather than, maybe I would rather say don't change anything, or if you want to change it, I still don't see why don't we use words like diligence, because I really think the prudence implies also there's a wording issue, a translation issue. If we have diligence, it's already a different word, for example, in German, which actually does really reinforces that you should neither overstate nor understate assets, neither overstate nor understate liabilities. And so I also think that we should have a stronger wording than in 314b to say, not just say the exercise of prudence does not imply a need for asymmetry. I would really say the exercise of prudence does not allow asymmetry. I think only then its neutrality principle is really enforced. And then we are clear what we mean if we want to use the word prudence.
Okay, so thanks, Mark. I think, you know, we are going to have a very careful look at drafting if we make this change. And I think, you know, that's where probably we would also need to have a look at the angst that ISB went through and their experience on this if we make the change, because this was very, very, very hard fought when ISB made this change. Yeah. So we note your sort of preferences in terms of overall approach, and then we'll have a look at drafting. Okay, so over Adrienne, then Bernard, then Renee, Adrienne, and Todd.
Thanks, Chair. I would support the first recommendation, not to adopt as a separate qualitative characteristic. But and also I will also support the drafting of Chapter 3A with a slight amendment, because now if prudence is meant to enforce neutrality, it should also mirror the opposite of prudence, and this is rightly elaborated in the following sentences. And the opposite is, I would say, temerity, or that would lead to overstatements. So I would amend the first sentence of 314A as neutrality is supported by the exercise of prudence and wariness for temerity. Because this is exactly what you say in the following sentences. It's not only prudence that should lead not to overstatements, but also understatements in some instances that would be as misleading as overstatements that would be driven by prudence. If we want to look for another word, maybe, as you can see, and I'm very fond of terminology, I would say circumspection, because this is the attitude of a preparer. A preparer should be circumspect in estimating or making judgments or materiality judgments in the preparation of financial statements. Would be, I think it's more meaningful. I mean, if prudence is used in many other frameworks, let's go for prudence, but be more explicit as what I said first, as mentioning also the opposite of prudence.
Okay, thanks, Adrian. So go to Bernard, then Renee, Adrian, and Todd.
Thanks, Chair. I'm supportive of staff recommendation, and the reason for being that is, like Camilla mentioned, I mean, it's a very commonly used principle in many countries, and there is no one definition. So I would actually be concerned if we really base it on a QC in itself, that we will find a definition which kind of encompasses everybody's views and kind of brings people in instead of dividing them again. So this is kind of where I am, and I think it's really stakeholder management. And what I really like about the two paragraphs is that we take a stance, in a sense, also to say what it's not, right? So regarding terminology, I mean, there are some trigger words, I would say, at least in German, and Thomas might want to come in on that. But I think it's important in that case that language will include people. So actually, I would phrase it whatever they phrase it, just to really make clear this is what you mean, right? When you talk about that principle, however we're gonna put it. But I'm happy to see more drafting on that. But I'm happy with the approach recommended.
Okay, thanks, Bernard. Go to Renee, and then Todd, Scott, and Lindy. Oh, sorry, Renee, Adrian, Todd. Apologies, Adrian.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. So yes, I agree to not make it a qualitative characteristic on its own right. The risk with prudence on its own, based on past experience, at least in our jurisdictions, I'm sure elsewhere, is the risk that it would be interpreted to mean conservatism. Sorry, did I say that right? Conservatism. Yeah. So one-sided view as opposed to neutrality. So connecting it to neutrality, to me, is and to us is the right way of doing it, because it conveys that it's neutral, it's objective. We don't mean my prudence to be conservative, which I think is something we wanted as a profession to move away from a number of years ago. Now we want to bring it back, but anchoring it in neutrality, to me, is very eloquent. Thank you.
Thanks, Renee. Adrian, then Todd.
So first point is to the people who were suggesting let's not use the word prudence. I think the whole point of this is to respond to people who worry about the fact that we don't have prudence. So I wouldn't support any approach that suggests substituting another word for prudence. We have to address prudence. My first preference would be to align with Europe, option C. I think we won't get support for this. So I think option B is a very good compromise, because it confronts the issue and it tries, somebody said it tries to include everybody. So if Camilla wanted to push very strongly for option C, I'd align with her and push, but otherwise I support option B and I don't support option A. Thank you.
Thanks, Adrian. That's very helpful to understand.
Yeah, thank you.
Todd, then Scott, then Lindy.
Thanks, Ian. I think my preference here would be to make no change to our conceptual framework because, like has been talked about by one or two people, I think Prudence has historically been seen as providing a level of conservatism or perhaps bias for understating assets or overstating liability. So I think it has been seen in that light. While I might have a preference for no change, I think I would agree with Adrienne's comment that we need to find a path through this which is acceptable to people like me that would probably prefer no change and those that might prefer it to be a qualitative characteristic. And so I can support what has been recommended here by staff as being a good compromise position. So while I come into this preferring not to change our framework, I think I would be happy to compromise with what is being suggested by staff, and we can debate the exact wording of the paragraphs, but I think broadly they are quite reasonable and are consistent with what the IASB has done.
Thanks, Todd. So then I will go to Lindy, and then I think I'll see whether there are any other comments. I know Adrienne wants to come in again, as does Mark. So I'll go to Scott, then Lindy.
Thank you, Ian. When I read it, I think I went, Prudence was more conservative. That was sort of my interpretation of it. So I hate to bring this up again, guys, but I did synonyms, okay? And I think the problem with the word is you can go on both sides of it. When you look at the synonyms, you get synonyms like practicality, discretion, cautiousness, shrewdness, judgment, pragmatism, and wisdom. So I think just the synonyms themselves are falling on both sides of the topic. So I would support the recommendation because I think we do need to try to define what we mean by it. And I think by attaching it to neutrality actually helps with this diversity of views about the word. So I would be supportive of what the recommendation is because of that.
Thanks, Scott. Lindy.
Thank you. So I agree that we do need to deal with prudence. I support staff's recommendation on how it gets located within our conceptual frameworks. I agree with that. I would also just caution though, and I think the paragraphs that we're suggesting to include 314A and 314B is from the IASB's conceptual framework. So I wouldn't amend the wording unless there's a public sector nuance to change to it. But I wouldn't go and change things just because of translation or interpretation issues, because I would imagine the IASB had similar concerns when drafting it. So unless there's a public sector nuance we need to introduce, which I don't think there is, I think it should be left as suggested by staff. Thank you.
Thanks, Lindy. So I will take final comments. I'm not going to go into the wording at this stage because we will need to bring it back. And I'm going to suggest that members actually make clear their, the areas where they have concerns with the existing drafting in written form to John, because really, I think Lindy's point is very valid that there was a lot of heartache in the ISB over getting this drafted. I'm sure translation was taken into account in that, but equally, I think the two things that we need to understand are, is there a public sector reason for alternative wording? Or is there a specific translation issue that hasn't been addressed? Because this was, and the whole, is it cautious or asymmetric prudence? And, the debate went round this and it was hotly contested. So we do need to be very, very careful about any changes that we're clear about why we're making them. Okay, so with that as the way forward, I'll take final comments from Adrienne, Mark and Thomas.
Thank you, Ian. I just wanted to add that prudence could be sometimes the opposite face of and an alibi also for window dressing the financial statements. If I may, not prolong in too much the discussion, refer to an anecdote, very fresh anecdote from an audit engagement. That was 10 days ago. I had to object to a provision made by an entity that was, as the auditee said, prudently accounting for an hypothetical possibility of disability cases of staff currently sick. And they said, oh, well, this is very prudent from us to account for that because we might in the future possibly, etc., etc. And I said, no, that's not prudence. That's window dressing. Of course, that was adding a provision to the financial performance. So in the end, what is important is that is the core of the paragraph 314A. Be very cautious in not understating, not overstating. Now, is there a specific reason for adapting the vocabulary to the public sector? I would say yes. One reason would be that in many, many instances, maybe not, maybe all, the public entity bears no legal consequences or criminal consequences in window dressing their financial reports. It's even more important that we have standards that require very strongly, as I said, circumspection, cautiousness, or whatever, all the synonyms that Scott listed. It's a very important issue for public entities, I would say, much more than for registered companies or whatever. I mean, these companies are under the scrutiny of shareholders, the public, much more than public entities are. That's it.
Okay, thank you. Mark, then Thomas.
Yeah, just very briefly, I support that we ask the stakeholders of the suggestion of what options they like, but also I think it's very important to our suggestion that we want actually to reinforce neutrality and also to ask stakeholders where they agree. But I think this would help clarify what's been said, what actually this word means, because it obviously has different objectives. And then I think we have moved a step further, because I also liked this analogy with the conservative versus neutrality, and I think this is actually the question, and I also agree it should not be conservative.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Thomas.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I think the discussion around what does prudence really mean is a philosophical discussion, and I think it's as old as the accounting discussion probably is in general, between the Anglo-Saxon perspective and, let's say, the continental European perspective, at foremost German perspective, what prudence would mean. So I think, and I think Mark made my point. I think it's good to kind of make a step, make a proposal, clarify what it is not, and go forward and go out to constituents and see what is in the public interest. I think it's correct that the IPSASB as an international standard setter has not to follow countries, but what countries are doing could be an indicator for what might be in the public interest. So it's good to go out, make the proposal, clarify what it is not, and then see and hear and listen what people say.
Okay, so thank you. So I think summing up where we've got to, I think overall, although it's not board members' first preference in all cases, there is agreement that we should go with approach B, which is to address prudence, but reinforce neutrality in our framework. Then we need to think about how we do that. I think there are quite a few different views that have been expressed in terms of issues with the current wording, reinforcements of the current wording, and so on. And I think what we need you to do, please, is actually to document those for John in terms of coming back with a proposal. I think in doing that, we have to be cognizant of the fact that this was a very, very heated debate when ISB firstly got rid of Prudence, and then that generated a huge amount of heat, not a lot of light, I would have to say, that then forced them to actually address Prudence in the 2018 update of the framework. So in going into this, I think Lindy's exhortation is very relevant, that we need to actually have a look at where ISB landed up and then review it from two perspectives. One is there something that is unique from the public sector perspective that causes us to change that wording? Because any change will confuse people when they look between the two frameworks. And B, we need to look at it from a translation perspective to see if there's any of the words that are used, that are proposed to use, cause a particular issue from a translation perspective. So I'm proposing that members address those two questions in responding to John, and then we will see this back in terms of the proposed drafting at our September meeting. John, are you okay with that as the way forward?
Yes, I'm okay with that as the way forward. I just wanted to respond briefly to Lindy. The wording in paragraphs 3.14a and 3.14b is largely that taken from the amendments made to the ISB framework. There are very minor wording changes, and paragraph 3.14b, one sentence discussing asymmetry as a qualitative characteristic has been removed, and that was following discussion with one stakeholder who argued that it was unclear and unnecessary. But I will elucidate that in the September papers so that it's very, very clear of any wording change where we differ from where the staff board sponsor proposal differs from the ISB wording. The last point I'd like to make is that whilst I understand some of the wording issues, I do think, and this goes back to Thomas, I do think that this issue, has been framed around the use of the word prudence. So I think there are risks if we start using different wording to mean what has previously in standard setting circles been discussed as prudence. But certainly I acknowledge that there are the kind of terminological linguistic issues that we encountered when we looked at capability, ability, capacity in the context of service potential. Okay, but thank you for the instruction, and I think that gives me enough to go on for September.
Okay, so thank you everyone. That was a good first discussion on prudence. And at least we have an overall way forward, though we need to look at the wording in depth. So John, then move us on to the third topic, which is materiality.
Yeah. The catalyst for the third topic, materiality, are some changes made at standards level and conceptually by the ISB in 2018. Now, initially, standards level changes to IPSAS 1 and IPSAS 3 were going to be considered as part of the improvements project, but it was decided that it would be inappropriate to action those changes prior to considering changes to the framework, and that it would be inappropriate to consider changes to the framework in isolation. And that explanation is is given in paragraph 9 of agenda item 8.2.3. So the discussion of our reaction to those IASB amendments in paragraph 6 to 12. We've also considered whether or not those amendments are consistent with the general line of travel of the literature of the International Accounting and Auditing Standards, or Auditing and Assurance Standards Board, and requirements and guidance in INTERSAI, the Supreme Audit Institution's international organization. That's addressed in paragraph 13 to 17. And basically we conclude that the changes to materiality are consistent with the IAASB's literature, and that they have been discussed between IAASB staff and IASB staff. And in paragraph 16, I give the conclusion of the IAASB that their guidance of both bodies is consistent, although the wording's not always congruent. Paragraph 17 indicates that INTERSAI hasn't actually directly addressed these modifications to the IASB's definition of materiality. So what we will do is to keep them updated. Further, we consider materiality and sustainability reporting, noting in paragraph 19 that it's unclear whether sustainability reports are general purpose financial reports, but that nonetheless, the proposed modifications we're suggesting to paragraph 3.32 of the framework are relevant to sustainability reports. And lastly, we look at materiality in the context of what is known in the Anglo-Saxon world as regularity assertions and statements. In other words, has expenditure been incurred in accordance with governing legislation and regulation? We conclude that there is no need for a change to the framework because we don't think that compliance assertions or statements are general purpose financial reports. We are suggesting a couple of minor paragraphs in the basis for conclusions. So to conclude, we think that the changes proposed to the framework which are given in paragraph 8, are small, but they are important. And they're important because they introduce this notion of obscuring information. Now, throughout the life of this board, and in particularly recently, I think materiality has been a very, very difficult issue. There does tend to be a checklist mentality towards disclosure, so that disclosures are made regardless of materiality. And making this minor change positions further work that the IPSASB may do on materiality, and is proposing in the work program consultation to undertake a development of a practice statement, drawing from the IASB practice statement on materiality. So we think that the changes are important, that they're logical, and that they should be made. I'd also like to move on then to the recommendations. They're threefold. The third of those recommendations is not actually in the paper, so it's put in for clarification purposes. So firstly, the revision of the subsection on materiality in chapter 3 should include the IASB 2018, the amendments to the IASB's 2018 framework. The 2 paragraphs on the basis for conclusion, reflecting a view that regularity is primarily a compliance requirement, and it's unnecessary to insert a reference in the core text of chapter 3. And then just to clarify what should be point C and comes up as a duplicate point A, where we think that these amendments should be made regardless of whether a decision is made to include a materiality practice statement following work programme consultation. So we don't, whilst we think that these amendments would be helpful in underpinning such a statement, we don't think that they are dependent on inserting that practice statement into the work programme. And at that point, through the chair, I'd ask the IPSASB if they agree with these recommendations. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, John. Open up for comments from members. Mike.
Thank you, Chair. John, I support John's recommendations. Ian, I just had a question in wording, which I can deal with later if you like, but I wasn't sure if we needed to make reference to the role of audit in some of these paragraphs. It's a separate consideration. It doesn't have to be in an accounting standard, I don't think, but I can pick it up with John later.
Mike, these are the proposed basis for conclusions paragraphs on regularity, is that?
That's right, yeah.
Can we deal with drafting offline anyway? Yeah. But no, yeah. I think, thanks, Mike, I understand your point. Okay, Mark.
I'm supportive of the suggestions. Just one question. I think it's clear that it doesn't have an impact on IPSAS 1. And we have a separate project, as you have a separate project proposed, so maybe it's more a communication issue, that it's clear to stakeholders that the current what is currently the current application of IPSAS 1 is not affected by this. If we mean it shouldn't be affected, because it's a conceptual framework.
Can I respond on that here? Yes, thanks, Mark. I think the timeline is that we will consider the reaction to proposing this change to the framework, and then probably in the improvements project for 2022, we would propose the changes to IPSAS 1 and IPSAS 3. If the amendment to the framework is supported, it would be inappropriate if people say, no, we disagree with this change, and the IPSASB alters course to make the change to IPSAS 1 and IPSAS 3 until we've considered the conceptual underpinning.
Okay. So can I go next to Scott and Adrienne?
Yeah, thank you. I promise this time not to look up any sentences for you, okay? So my question is on the basis of conclusion in paragraph 21, and it's the last sentence on the BCY. It's not editorial. It's more or less, I don't think the board has concluded that such statements are not TPRF. In other words, even in paragraph 19, the staff says think it's unclear whether it is or not, but in the basic conclusion, we said we decided it was. I think until we actually deliberate that, it should be more neutral.
John, I mean, it strikes me that now's the time, actually, if anybody just, that we should be clear what the board thinks on that.
But I don't think we've discussed it in long. I mean, we referred to it, but we really haven't had a big discussion about it.
Yeah. Yeah, I certainly accept that. I think if I could, Ian, there is an issue as to, well, do we actually need to say anything in the basis for conclusions anyway? Yeah. So there's a prior issue there.
Well, I'll take other comments before we decide what to do with that. Adrienne?
Thanks, yeah. Well, back on that, the last comment, question is it a basis for conclusion or is it not? If it's not, let's get rid of it. Now, I fully support the recommendation as a whole. I also support the last sentences referring to auditors or audit matters, audit issues. because it is certainly, based on my experience as a public auditor, there's a need to definitely clarify possible misunderstandings in the mind of preparers who eventually become auditees. So a preparer is at some point in time, later time, is an auditee. It's important that everybody knows what are the statuses of those, statements or assertions. So I support that we keep the last sentences in paragraph in BC3 YA and B.
Okay, Lynn.
So this last discussion slightly links to a conversation John and I have had offline about materiality by nature, and it's in these regularity type instances where auditors often qualify opinions because something is irregular by its nature, not always by its value. And I guess I come from the sort of, I think it is a preparer's issue. I think that if you think something is material by its nature, you should be disclosing that somewhere in your general purpose financial statements. And if something becomes material because it's irregular, you've done something wrong with that transaction, then the preparer should identify and disclose that. John and I have sort of exchanged some wording for the main framework on that, but I think the BC should reflect that sort of tone, that it is not just an audit issue, which I think was the point Mike was making on the BCs as well, that preparers have a responsibility to consider what's material by nature and ensure that it's appropriately accounted for and disclosed.
Thanks, then. So just to, before we go any further on the audit side, can we just be clear that we are writing a financial reporting standard? So we are not binding auditors in terms of materiality. This is materiality from a preparer perspective, notwithstanding the comments that you've just made, Lynn, which would obviously influence that. So I think in revisions to the wording, John, we need to be very, very careful about any reference to audit with that in mind. Okay, so with that I'll move on and take and actually at some stage I would like to hear comments from people who are not auditors, because I think everybody I've heard from so far is an auditor. I think, and I'm going to continue that because the next two contributions are both from auditors or former auditors, Mike and Mary.
Thank you, Ian. Well said. I'll take the neck on the knuckles. But I agree with what you're saying. I mean, to me, I don't mind if the references to audit are there, but to say that the assessment of materiality on such statements is primarily an audit issue just isn't right. Management have to take responsibility first. Yeah.
Thanks, Mike. Mary.
Thank you. From the Supreme Audit Institution's point of view, the audit point is accuracy, regularity, and economy, efficiency, and effectiveness. And it differs from the financial reporting objective. So I think from my point of view, it is different from the preparation of the financial statements. Thank you.
So thanks, Mary. I think that actually is a good summary of what we've heard so far, that there is a difference here. What we need to do, though, is actually articulate it more clearly, I think, because as Lynn expressed, there are, inevitably there's an interplay with the discussions that you will have as a preparer with your auditors in terms of significance and risks around exceeding parliamentary authorities, or things like, the pandemic, expenditure on the pandemic that suddenly become very, very sensitive. So I think in terms of I'm hearing support for making or for proposing the amendments in the conceptual framework. I think there is certainly some of the discussion that I know has been going on, in terms of this idea about sort of materiality by nature, if you like. I think, clearly we need to get the drafting right in terms of the interplay between financial reporting and audit, but we need to be very careful that, as Mike said, ultimately in terms of the financial statements, the responsibility for the judgments therein rests with those preparing and authorising the financial statements. So I think with that in mind, probably what I would suggest again is probably as we're going to do with Prudence, that actually those that would like to propose amendments to the wording that John has put forward here should contact him, with suggestions in terms of alternative drafting, so that he can start to synthesize those to bring back firm proposals for us to look at again in September, reflecting the discussion that we've had this morning. Is that okay then, as a way forward? John, you're content with that as a way forward, and that gives you what you need in terms of direction?
Yes, I think so. Thanks, Ian. Just to respond to Lynn's point, Lynn's provided some wording which I've worked with Lynn and Henning on, and I'll bring that forward in September, clearly indicating what it is, and we can look at.
But I think in the context, let's have a look at that, though, in the context of what others say in the meantime. Because there clearly will be a number of other comments which may or may not interface with that.
Yeah, fine. Okay.
So I think that was, again, a helpful first discussion on these issues, and I think we have an overall direction of travel, and then John can bring back some proposals in terms of drafting for September.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. I think with that, Ross, anything else in terms of the meeting that we need to deal with today?
Nothing else in terms of the technical meeting, just that we now have the social that we'll go into, hoping that everybody can stick around. And I think maybe just a lead into Leah, who is going to deal with the administration and getting everyone in the